Thank you very much for coming back. So the second half of our panel is going to focus on the question of, in a line, we live in an age where conspiracies are very prominent. It's very connected to, again, to the internet. It's brought a lot of theories that may have been at the sediment of society into the center of society. Also, there's a wonderful study by the Institute of Advanced Studies in Lucca, in Italy, which came out a couple of weeks ago. You should all really have a look at it if you're interested in questions to do with propaganda and information, where basically, I mean, they don't affirm this, but they seem to suggest that because there are so many information sources now, people don't trust anyone. They start trying to connect the dots themselves. And so the very nature of the information age, this sort of the plethora of media drives people to think in a more conspiratorial way. I think that's also very interesting. But is conspiracy undermining democracy? We're going to look at this in several ways and what we can do to combat conspiracy theories. From different angles, a couple of new people, Anne Applebaum, who doesn't need any introduction, Rashid Ali, sorry, I know him as Rash, that's terrible. Rashid Ali, who is a senior fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, which is the institute that Charlie was mentioning that works in this one-on-one work with people being sucked into jihadi ideology. But I'm going to start with Sirja. Sirja, you get this a lot. I've started to get it a bit. Lots of my friends have as well in Russia. You try to do something, you try to do some activism, journalism, and before you know it, authoritarian regimes are telling you you're part of a great conspiracy. I thought it was just the Russians doing it, but I can see Erdogan's doing this. It's like a default setting for authoritarian rulers to accuse any kind of opposition as being part of a conspiracy. When has it been used against you? And can you map out, because you started to, you're working on a paper for us that really deconstructs sort of the building blocks of this conspiracy narrative. So just talk us through it.
Well, I mean, it's like I experienced it as a Serbian student, and of course Milosevic was using it to kind of dismantle Otpor. And there are levels in this narrative. First, when you appear and start mutiny or protest or keeping your government accountable, then you will be a seduced student. And then you're going to move into a traitor, because obviously protesting your government while there is a war with Bosnia and Croatia is not patriotic. You are undermining the efforts of the state. And then, of course, the third level would be why you are doing this, because nobody normal can do it. It's, of course, because you are getting money from abroad. And, since 1996, when my phone was stopped the first time, I'm still waiting for this big fat check from Langley. But it never appeared. And then, of course, it escalates into something absolutely stupid, like the Serbian movement was officially labeled a terrorist organization. We are talking about the youth movement where average age was 21, which was super committed to the nonviolent struggle. So this narrative has the building blocks. Guess what? 2003, we start working with Georgians and Ukrainians, and they tell us, what is the first thing the government is doing? They're putting labels. So now we are traitors, and now we are living in the age where even without touching Serbs, you will find the top Erdogan advisor coming on a TV on Gezi and saying, this is imported from Serbia. Of course, I grow like 5 centimeters, but we have nothing to do with this. So this idea that it's foreign conspiracy stupid has become a kind of mantra for all of this regime. So when you look at why it's there and what it achieves to do, the very purpose of nonviolent struggle, just to repeat, I'm boring, you win by numbers. Numbers are never on the fringe, numbers are in the middle of society. So labeling you as foreign agents, foreign conspirators, this and that, creates a social distance between you and the people you want to mobilize. Of course, nobody will join you because you are supposedly a terrorist organization, or nobody will come working in your NGO in Russia because you're getting money from abroad, which makes you a foreign agent, and you need to label yourself as a foreign agent. So social distance is one side of it. Second, very interesting side of it that my friend Peter Pomerantsev always inspired me to talk it, is that because of lack of ideology, this government says, okay, the situation in Russia is so bad, but the West is worse. So this cynicism and this type of thing, also kind of replacement of standard ideology for authoritarian regimes. So yes, we are bad, but the others are worse. And this is where this conspiracy works great. Last and very important for me and the fellow activists we work with across the world is, how do you fight this thing? And this is really, really interesting things. Like, you want to deconstruct it and look at what it is, and you want to look at the successful examples. I'm so sorry we didn't have time to watch a short video, but we can post it on the website after that, which we produced for the activists worldwide, which shows these labels, but also how they are fighting it. First thing, as we mentioned recently, was alternative narrative. For Serbs, it was really, really important to develop the narrative because the state always wants to stay in the middle, and they always want to say, if you are not with us, then you're traitors and you're not patriotic, and being pro-Putin is the only way to deal with patriotism. So with Milosevic, it was easy. Being a patriotic Serbs mean hating Croats, hating Bosnians, being afraid of the West. If you're not, then you're a foreign mercenary or a traitor. And of course, you will look at our traditional friends in Russia, Cuba, China, whoever was supporting him. And we twisted this narrative and say, no, being a good Serb means being a good neighbor to Croats and Bosnians. And that means getting our country a renowned international name as not being a leprosy island, which he was turning Serbia into. And that was the narrative we named the new patriotism. So the reason why it was effective was that it was appealing to a lot of people, but it was also a kind of alternative to existing state narrative. Second was to develop channels for this narrative. One of the things that authoritarian governments do, they control the state media and they can make even control over the alternative media. So you need to find a way to communicate it. In a very offline time in the 90s, it was municipality-controlled radio and TV stations, and municipalities were run by the opposition. So through these channels, this narrative was kind of given to the people, and people could really see the truth. That was the boring part. The funny part was that you really mock the narrative or the channel. So when you look at your government's narrative, that was exactly what we were doing. We're saying, okay, we are a terrorist because we are wearing glasses. And whoever wears glasses reads a lot, and it's very dangerous to read a lot in this country. So every single activity we did was playing this narrative back. So whenever on a TV screen the president of the parliament appears and said, these are the powers of the chaos and insanity, that would become the most popular badge on the street tomorrow. So I am the power of the chaos and insanity. And so whenever they say it's like they are supporting the following orders of the Western imperialism, we immediately printed 10,000 little flags of every single country in the world. So everybody was in the street. I was a little Brit, and she was a little Russian, and she would be a little Pole. And we were marching under foreign flags, exactly as they are naming us. So by mocking this narrative was a really, really interesting way to deal with it. And you can decide to mock narrative, or you can decide to mock the channel. Because the propaganda channels are very often being hated by the people. So when you look at the Solidarity movement, for example, in Poland, what they were doing, in the time of the state TV news, they would just take their TVs, put them in the strollers, and take them out for the walk. Low risk, super funny, everybody can do it, and sends a very powerful message about the TV station and also what's in the government narrative. As well as the very popular badge in my country was, I would love to live in the country from state TV news. Unfortunately, this is not this country, but if there would be a country from state TV news, I will go straight there. So one way to tackle it is to develop a parallel narrative. Another way is to deliver your message through your own kind of channels. And last but not of least importance, you can play with it and mock it and not taking it too seriously.
Last, we can come back to this because I want to move on to the other guys. But isn't there sort of a pleasure in the conspiracy narrative? Isn't it also giving the audience, apart from fear and all these kind of like obvious things, isn't it also feeding a desire in the audience for something? Because it works quite well. Is there something there that they're registering in the audience? Yeah,
very interesting thing is, like, on one hand, the reasons why this narrative is there is to persuade you that it's all done by outsiders and big forces and CIA and MI6 and FSB. So please don't even try to be active. This is very dangerous because not only that these governments are treating their citizens as a sheep, they want to treat you as a sheep. And they want to tackle from you the very idea that if something has to be changed, it has to be you. So you need to take this ring to Mordor. But in the same time, it's like there is a little seductive thing which explains, for example, why this narrative are playing well on the intellectual left, which is really interesting for me. They really love to be lazy. And of course, nothing can be done because the evil CIA, FSB, and everybody else will do it. So it kind of played for intellectual laziness, and it also serves to the purpose of that people can't do anything, there can't be something like bottom-up change. And if you are mutiny or asking where your government is spending your money, it's only because somebody from abroad trained you to do that, or explained to do that. That brings us to my favorite video, was in 2007, when Chavez lost the referendum to prolong his reign forever constitutionally by a group of students. He appeared on TV showing the Otpor booklet, like the Serbian booklet, and comparing this sign to the sign of Venezuela movement resistance. It's like the evil Serbs have seduced millions of Venezuelan students. And I was like, I didn't know it's like we are so powerful. So it's like the very idea that the people can do it from the bottom up is what really frightening these people.
No, I find that very interesting. So on the one hand, it's actually, there is an ideology there. The ideology is the individual is no one. The individual is always a puppet of greater forces. But also a slight pleasure, it's not your fault. If you're a failure, if your society is a failure, it's also somebody else's fault.
Yeah.
So there is
It's always a conspiracy
there's a
stupidity.
seduction there as well, which I find interesting. Really, from a very different context, Rashad, you've encountered the use of conspiracies by jihadi movements. How does one go around working with that in that very interesting sort of sphere that you operate in?
Yeah, I was just listening actually. There's some really interesting things about how the same conspiracy mindset spreads actually. And the point you just ended on, that actually it's both empowering and disempowering, in the sense that you can very squarely blame another group of people. Either it's the Christian Zionists or just Jews in general. And they happen to be the super powerful entity that are controlling the entire world and bringing everything around. And so that feeds into this kind of very much removing any responsibility and agency from yourself, but also actually presenting this kind of very singular point of focus on where you need to kind of draw all your energy to. And in that kind of context, it is quite interesting that you'll hear all sorts of wacko kind of conspiracy theories, and not just from the Islamist side, but shared by, like you mentioned, the pseudo-intellectual left. Sorry. By that, I wasn't meaning Peter, but actually, just as an example,
It's always you.
It's just before Seamus Milne took his post at the shadow propaganda person for Corbyn. He wrote a piece explaining how ISIS was created by the US, and this was published in the Guardian, and it is actually an interesting thing that actually somebody there could publish that in a mainstream newspaper and it would get such kind of... So it actually has spread quite far. And the point about undermining democracy, one of the researchers that looked at people that watched JFK, great film, entertaining, but actually it is just made up and people forget that he's joined those dots and decided to make it up into a big conspiracy. But the impact of it is people that watched it were less likely to actually take part in voting. Quite literally, to less likely to take part in the democratic process. So I think it is actually quite serious in the impact it has both on society, but also as a narrative of hate. Because once you've got one person to blame for everything, you can always go back to it. So to come back to the kind of jihadi narrative and the jihadi scene, you'll find people that will say the Jews were behind the Holocaust and the Holocaust didn't exist. And they will carry both narratives at precisely the same time, because human beings can do that. You can believe two contradictory ideas as long as you just don't think about it too much. You won't cause too much trouble. And in that context, it is actually quite common to hear people still speak of 9/11 conspiracy. And the really interesting examples of that were the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime which described the 9/11 conspiracy as being something which the US were behind. And then Ayman Zawahiri actually responded by saying, no, we did it. And actually the Iranians are only saying that because they're trying to hide their affiliation with the US. I.e. there was a counter-conspiracy which they put out to undermine the conspiracy that it was the US. So all of those you get the type of... And there are various different approaches that people have taken. And I think the kind of thing we were talking about was the rooting within Islamic theological responses. so if you bear with me a little bit, there is, I guess, Islamic epistemological resources to deal with some of this stuff. So in books of creed or theology or Islamic jurisprudence, they talk about sources of knowledge. And they have this division as to what is mass transmitted knowledge and what is individually transmitted knowledge, and how mass transmitted knowledge, abandoning it, would lead you to becoming outside the pale of Islam. So they say things like, you've never been to Mecca, but you know it's there. Or you've never been to China, but you know it's there. And anyone denying this stuff would lead to denying orthodox Islamic beliefs. And it sounds a little bit strange as to why. Because Islamic knowledge is rooted upon mass transmission of historical data and facts. Hence, they will argue that just denying mass transmitted data is a means of unbelief. And there was a scholar by the name of Hamza Yusuf in the US who kind of utilized this to say, look, all you kind of Holocaust deniers, you are actually disrupting the very essence of all our historicity. You know, there are millions of people that experienced it. There's data, there's evidence, there's mass stories, mass transmission. If you're going to start denying history like this, you undermine the whole edifice of basic Islamic belief. Similarly, the notion of conspiracy, one of the dogmas in Islamic history was this notion of mass transmitted facts precluded conspiracy. That's actually one of the definitions of what they call a mutawatir fact. A mass transmitted fact was one that completely was devoid of conspiracy. So when you talk to people, individuals, and you talk about things like 9/11, there's two things that come very clear. These people have never had any engagement with government. Because anyone who's had any engagement with government, the idea that various departments of government can coordinate together to do anything in particular, is ludicrous. And the idea that that would happen across departments in the States. I've just come back from the States. And the idea that Homeland Security has any idea what the FBI are doing, or the Department of Defense has any idea what the NCTC is doing. There's so many damn agencies there in the first place. That the idea that they would all conspire to do anything is far-fetched, let alone conspire in such a systemic way. And when you start breaking this down, then actually this irrationality starts to undermine basic dogmas of how we know the Prophet Muhammad existed, how we know the message of Islam is transmitted. The Quran is mass transmitted by oral reports.
So the Quran is basically MSM, it's mainstream media.
So the idea then is that you need to root it in basic ideas of epistemology. And you can have these types of debates. It sounds quite far-fetched, but actually you can have these, you'll have these kinds of debates where people immediately post Charlie Hebdo, people will say, well, really, did these shootings actually take place? Were they not shootings by the French authorities? You're seeing people now present these as, what's the phrase? False flag operations and things like this. And actually rooted in that is a basic denial of facts. And when you start to go back, the psychology, I guess, is that you talk about individuals that are in the echo chamber you spoke about. It's the echo chamber that reinforces their points of view. And when you start to take people out of that and you start to say, well, hold on a second, the chaps who were killed, the mosque that this individual belonged to refused to have his funeral prayer in France. His family came out and denounced him. Other individuals around him that spoke about what he was like, that he was in prison and he has a prison record. Oh, and here's a phone call he made to and actually you build up the number of facts. And so in the same way as they say that you destroy, eventually you break someone that's delusional, is by the multiple number of facts that come up that break their distorted worldview, that make them realize they're not the Messiah, or in this case, really it isn't a messianic mission to be part of ISIS or the Islamic State, etc. And so those types of things, they break that mentality, and that's the only way in. It's the kind of thing you're talking about on a minor scale. Though on a mass scale, you're talking about how do you create that indigenous revolution, but actually what you're doing here is you're creating something in the mind that then opens outwards. So to give another example of that, one of the groups, Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is a revolutionary Islamist party, and the reason they're important is they believe in a global caliphate that removes all the borders between Muslim majority countries. So Syria and Iraq shouldn't have separate countries, it's one country. They believe in implementing punishments such as stoning to death or killing apostates or capital punishment for homosexuality, etc., etc. So as a movement, they share the ideological tenets, the views on religiosity that ISIS have. They issued a leaflet explaining to their followers, because they're mainly Middle Eastern, that actually Jews do not control the US. That US politics is not shaped by Jewish conspiracy theory, it's shaped by capitalists. And they're the ones that call the shots. And that's what's important to understand about US society. It's a capitalist ideology. That's what's fundamental. The same group also issued a leaflet implying that 9/11, the US were kind of aware of it. So you have this kind of duality about it. And the ability to hold very extreme ideological beliefs and the ability to hold contradictory mentalities. Well, on the one hand, they will shoot down some conspiracy theories, but on the other hand, they will push their own.
And the mention of capitalists sort of made me think of the past. There's a great little book by, again, Ivan Krastev, who's sort of here, but not here in this conversation, which looks at Marxism as one massive conspiracy theory. I don't necessarily agree or disagree. I thought it was quite witty, though. Historically, how have conspiracy theories been used by mass political movements?
First of all, I would say it's not far off saying Marxism was a massive conspiracy theory, because it was an idea that you could, kind of interpret history in a single way and find, and almost everything, every piece of evidence in society could be used to explain what had happened, and you could demonstrate that everything was about the exploitation of the working class if you only parsed the argument in a certain way. And Marxism also had, and this is not so much Marxism as Marxist-Leninism, this is about how Lenin interpreted Marx. Marxism also had an obsession with that all the institutions of bourgeois society are fake, that political parties are fake, that social organizations are fake, that all of them are covers for something else. So if you have a political debate in a bourgeois society is really a phony, it's really all about capitalism and money, it's not really about ideas. Or if you have a group of civic organizations, they're all in the pay of somebody who's trying to get power. So, and this was true from the time the Bolsheviks took power in 1917, 1918. And already in the 1920s, they were arresting. There's a famous. There's quite a famous Russian literary critic called Likhachov, who was arrested in the 1920s for belonging to a Greek sort of philosophical society where the members would speak Greek words to one another at each one of their meetings. And this was, of course, considered to be highly suspicious and dangerous because, why would you do that and what could it possibly mean? So the understanding that, and then what happened, of course, over the course of the Bolshevik Revolution was that the conspiracy understanding changed to suit the circumstances, and it also eventually began to serve to explain Bolshevism's failures. And so what happens in the 1930s, late 1920s and 1930s, is that as Bolshevism doesn't produce what it's promised, it doesn't produce the workers' paradise, and it doesn't produce heaven on earth, and it doesn't produce societies richer than capitalist societies, it needs to explain why not. And this is when you begin to get, the conspiracy, the Trotskyism and the Polish conspiracy and the various groups that are supposed to be organizing against the state. So then it gets flipped around and used as an explanation for why it's not working. And I think that, in that sense, it has some in common, certainly with Russia today, is that the explanation for why things aren't working the way they're supposed to be working and why it's not all going so well has to be. I would add one element other to your description of how authoritarians use this idea that it's a foreign conspiracy, a very good one. There's a new one, though, that's very often used, and this is not only being used by authoritarians. The other one is to flip the arguments about corruption on their head. So one of the most successful kind of anti-authoritarian narratives in Eastern Europe has been about the authorities being corrupt, and because the authorities are corrupt, and they generally, that's how they function, that's how they became powerful. And so and particularly in Russia, there was a very successful anti-corruption movement led by Alexei Navalny and among many others that began to identify the leaders of the country as corrupt. And what has been happening since then is that the Russian authorities have tried to flip it on, saying, no, it's Alexei Navalny who's corrupt. And they've pinned, they look for ways of pinning accusations on his family, on other members of his movement. And this has actually been used in other countries as well, a kind of fake corruption narrative. Or, where does her money come from? It must be, why does she have so much money? It must be, somebody must have given it to her. She can't have earned it.
With a reason.
And so this is and even when there's no evidence or there's no solid proof of anything, just juxtaposing, a photograph of a politician with a rich businessman. Well, what does that mean? Maybe he must be corrupt if they're having dinner together. So this is a kind of new tactic that I think has also been very important.
I think it's very it's very interesting to see how they have evolved the conspiracy narratives. I don't know if it's the same in sort of the context that you look in, but certainly in the European context, the Nazis obviously used conspiracy theories, and E.H. Gombrich, the art historian, actually spent the Second World War analysing German propaganda, Nazi propaganda, for the BBC, and his conclusion was that conspiracy narrative was more dangerous than the racist narrative, because the conspiracy narrative set up the us and them, the world, the kind of the intellectual paradigm within which you could project sort of anti-Semitism into. That was actually the foundation. The difference now, when I look at some of the conspiracies, is that they never actually stop. I mean, before they used to be like, it was capitalists or Jews or whatever. With Navalny, it gets much more complicated. They'll do one saying he's corrupt, then they'll do another one saying, actually, he's from the Kremlin. Don't believe him. He's one of us. So so somebody who's supporting him is going, oh my God, but what if he's actually from the Kremlin? If he's from America, that's okay. I'm against the Kremlin, but he's from the Kremlin, God. And there's some great Russian conspiracy videos out there, very well produced, always in true conspiracy style. You can't say who made them. I mean, it's always not the Kremlin who made them. But there's one about why does America want to start a war in Ukraine? Well, it starts with sort of like a Russian guy sitting with a bunch of beer, watching TV, really nice animation. And it's like, you've heard all these people who've been calling for us to go to war in Ukraine. And that's mainly Russian nationalists and patriots and people near the Kremlin, like Zhirinovsky. They're actually working for the CIA. You're like, oh, hold on. Everyone who I was meant to believe was actually for the CIA. Because America actually controls the highest levels of Russian power. This is a pro-Kremlin video. And it's trying to manipulate us into a war in Ukraine because they want to start World War III because Obama... And it goes on and on and on. And by the end, you don't trust anyone. Can you just sit there, completely paranoid, drinking beer, going... It's almost like going, Putin, hug me because I'm cold.
Can you just for everybody here clarify that it's not the CIA though?
Who?
That were behind that all?
Oh, okay.
Just on behalf of the CIA, I meant. But
I mean, yes. I'll just ask. But what's interesting is, I have no idea if they are. But what's interesting is that conspiracy is being used as the ideology in itself. It doesn't stop anywhere. It's just people have the sense they live in this endless conspiracies. They feel hopeless. They want to stay at home, drink beer, and just watch football. It's a pacifier.
And it works in democratic societies too.
Yeah, it works very well. I mean, we talked a little bit about ISIS today and the use of the internet. I mean, how are ISIS tapping into the sort of new conspiracy ideologies?
Well, like any decent totalitarian movement, decent is probably the wrong word, but any kind of well-practiced totalitarian movement, ISIS love a good conspiracy, and they use it broadly for, at least in my experience, talking to people out there. They use it in two main ways. There's the using it instead of ideology. So not everyone who is even fighting for ISIS believes in the ideology itself. They maybe just want political change. Maybe they are kind of... The guy who I'm thinking of is this man called Suhaib, he was a disseminator, very, very prominent disseminator of propaganda, who said that he lived in Baghdad. He was definitely Iraqi, but he doesn't speak to me anymore, sadly. But he was very interesting because he was someone who I spoke with at length about why he does what he does. Why is he circulating these videos of people being killed? Why is he circulating these pictures of children going to fairs? What's behind him? Why is he doing it if he's not a jihadist? And he would say, well, no one is supporting Iraqi Sunnis. In fact, everyone hates Iraqi Sunnis. He would say the Saudis are helping the Sunnis in Yemen, the Turkish are helping the Sunnis in Syria, but no one cares about Iraqi Sunnis. And that's why he was doing it. And he was a very, very prominent guy. He had 15,000, 16,000 followers before his account was suspended, and now he's still floating around out there doing his disseminating, but from a very unideological background. And I think that where conspiracy becomes a replacement for ideology, that's where it's really interesting and very, very dangerous, because it's a lot more difficult to resolve.
It's probably also the fact that actually certain conspiracies, they seem to resonate with how people perceive reality given the certain context that you're living in. So if you are an Iraqi Sunni and the Iranians are, you know, they have their militia out randomly throughout Iraq in Sunni areas killing people. You have Assad bombing his people. You have the Americans apparently sharing the same airspace as the Iranians and the Assad regime. You then have the Russians joining in, and they're, 80% of their bombings are on civilian areas. And so the only conclusion you come to is, well, hold on a second, everybody out there is literally conspiring against me, and the only people that I have any truck with are the Islamic State, because they seem to be fighting on my side. Although the irony being the Islamic State did put out a statement saying, Russia aren't bombing us. Almost as if to say, well, look, they're claiming to bomb us, but, they're not actually attacking us.
I mean, it's interesting. Nick Cull, brilliant professor of public diplomacy at the University of California, spoke here, and he talked about the history of counter-propaganda. And the interesting point he made was that research by the US, I think it was during the Second World War, into people who want to believe in conspiracies and rumors, it's not stupid people, it's quite the opposite. It's people who are smart, who can't quite connect the dots, as you say, and end up, their brains go over, into overdrive. People who are stupid just sit at home, they don't care. It's actually a mark of a smart people lost in an information kind of either vacuum or what we have now, kind of overload. Which again comes back to our first point, that the age of information actually pushes us not towards a greater understanding of reality, but pushes us towards sort of a more conspiratorial worldview.
One more thing we tackle in this, and we may want to give a food for thought for the audience. It's like the funny thing is that not only the people that you want to influence believe in conspiracy, but you may end up believing in your own conspiracy theory. Yeah. And when we were 2000, Milosevic fell, 2001, we got access to our secret police files. So here am I sitting in the police station with a policewoman. I can't take my file out, but I'm really passionate about reading what's inside. So there is 180 pages of whatever I was talking, my girlfriend, where she was going blah, blah, blah. And when you were reading it, you understand that these guys were firm believers in the fact that the operational center of Serbian opposition movement is in Washington, D.C. It wasn't. It was in the living room of my parents. But the fact that they were putting facts into this context gave them the completely false analytics. And if you were ever doing analytics, you know that facts that you get are as well as your analytic optic is. So what happens now is now we have a minor incident in Macedonia a few months ago, a Balkan country which was never the part of the big global stories. Immediately you have Lavrov stepping out and saying, this is the part of conspiracy to dismantle the South Stream, or whatever, Turkish Stream, which is the replacement for South Stream, and which just appeared that the Macedonia is on the road, so they want to destabilize this government, and this is basically the part of the Cold War. Now my question is, does he believe this? Because if he believes this, then they are creating their foreign policy out of narrative. If you take a look at the internet, you understand that the same people are protesting the same corrupted government in Macedonia for same reasons for 8 years, where there was no Turkish Stream, South Stream, or they were not on the road at all. But for some reasons they need to put this thing in a context, and now they intervene. They start supporting Macedonian government. This is a minor international topic, but you see the pattern is there. So what if this can backfire against these guys, and ending up like the fact that Milosevic was looking at Washington, D.C., and not in the living room of my parents was very harming to him. Because if he was looking at the living room of my parents, he would really see where the little hobbits are taking the ring to throw it into the mountain, while he was looking across the ocean with his big eye, and looking at the big bad guys conspiring to import.
I'm just going to say there's a historical precedent for this, which is one of the biggest and most important questions in Soviet history is, did Stalin believe what he was saying? And there's always been, there have always been different people arguing about whether he was really, it was all cynical and he was in fact a nationalist, or did he really believe in the various conspiracies that he saw and in the both abroad and at home. And actually, I have to say, having read a lot of the documents and having read the conversations, is that he certainly uses the language of someone who believes it, and almost everybody around him is using the language of someone who believes it, and they all talk like that all the time, consistently, on or off the record, in secret or public documents, and so you have to at some point believe that they believed it. And the other example of this that I think is a really interesting recent one is Putin in Ukraine, and it's fairly clear that when Putin began his invasion of eastern Ukraine, which, as you recall, involved these small attempted coup d'etat in several eastern Ukrainian cities, it's fairly clear that he thought that they would win because he believed his own story about Ukraine, which is that Ukraine isn't really a country, and that everybody in Ukraine who speaks Russian is really Russian, and they will therefore flock to as soon as they're able, they'll join Russia. And that, of course, didn't happen. And the only places that eventually joined Russia were the places where there was actually an invasion. And but he misunderstood Ukraine because he believed, this very old, actually, and that's another long story, a very old KGB story about Ukraine not being real and Ukrainian nationalism being a false import.
Yeah, your parents' apartment sounds amazing. It's got like hills and like Sauron's cauldron inside. Drinking your own Kool-Aid is what we call it.